In April 1939, fearing Adolf Hitler's land grabs could trigger a Second World War, US President Franklin Roosevelt sent the Führer a telegram.
Roosevelt has asked Hitler to promise not to invade this long list of countries over the next decade.
Hitler's response was defiant.
Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina, Ägypten.
This is underpinned by his view that the United States is degenerate, that Roosevelt is an imbecile, that the United States Army is nothing.
What Roosevelt is doing here is basically feeling Hitler out. Is Hitler this dynamic, energetic new statesman just trying to rebuild a Germany that was destroyed by the First World War? Or is Hitler plotting a war of aggression?
But the speech was more than a mockery of Roosevelt's request. Hitler told a national radio audience he had established a greater living space for Germany without bloodshed or war. But his goal would ultimately cost 60 million lives. Hitler. Who was the man behind the monster?
There were just so many parts of this story that didn't add up.
Teenage loner turned national hero.
He was the Messiah for the German people.
How was he able to achieve it?
All of it was an act. All of it was a show.
This is the definitive guide to the most hated man in history. Adolf Hitler regarded himself as a leader driven by destiny to make Germany great again. This cast-iron self-belief would soon see him march Germany into a Second World War and 6 years of carnage. By April 1939, Hitler had assumed control of Czechoslovakia, and he celebrated by throwing himself an extravagant 50th birthday party. It featured the biggest parade in German history. 5 hours long, 50,000 soldiers, and a crowd of 2 million.
When Hitler celebrates his 50th birthday, he thinks of himself as being a messianic figure. Of course, having huge festivities to mark his birthday is a classic dictatorial thing to do. It represents a triumph not just of the will, but also of his own ego.
The endless spectacle was just the beginning of the festivities.
Across Germany, people send Hitler presents, gifts of food or ornaments, books, and they write him poems telling him, you know, what a great leader he is, what a hero.
What the German people actually like about Hitler is that he's simply torn up the Versailles Treaty. This is a remarkable achievement. He's done all this without having to risk a world war.
His high command also lavished him with gifts, including statues, paintings, and tapestries.
Himmler gives him a portrait of his great hero, Frederick the Great. Goering gives him a kind of hideous, gaudy model of the Museum of German Art. Gift giving becomes extremely competitive.
But despite all the adulation, Hitler wasn't satisfied.
Hitler assumes that, you know, there's one genius born a century and that he's that guy and that he's attained the age of 50 and hasn't enacted that genius yet.
And this is why he's so keen to invade other countries and get things done. He is a man who feels he's got a destiny that has to be achieved very, very quickly.
Hitler's rise to power had been built on his skills at manipulating the image of himself and the Nazi Party. Now he focused on reinventing Germany's image.
Hitler wants to transform Berlin from a simple capital of Germany to a world capital. He really wants it to be seen as the dominant city in the world. That is, it literally dominates the world.
He gave this monumental task to Albert Speer, his top architect and one of his few personal friends.
So this is really that moment in which the world of architecture and the world of conquest come together. Hitler's office. The new Reichschancellery is really a very important building that shows us how Hitler is staging his power for the foreign diplomatic corps. The idea is that you have to walk through these series of spaces before you got to the very middle of the Chancellery, which is a long hall modeled after the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles. And in the middle of that hall is Hitler's office. So you would have to make this very long trek. Before you actually came to the point, which was to meet and greet and talk to Hitler.
The new Reich Chancellery was just one part of Hitler's vision of a Nazi super city called Germania.
It is going to be vast. It is going to be the center of the world's strongest military and of the strongest people, this racial view of the world as well.
These private images taken by his personal cameraman Walter Frenz show how Hitler scrutinized Speer's designs.
There are models of Germania and all the buildings in the Reich Chancellery, and after dinner, like a little boy with his train set, the obsessive Hitler will go and, walk around these models and peer through the little windows and archways and imagine himself at the heart of this new Nazi utopia that he will one day build.
By May 1939, Hitler was in no mood to waste time. Out of sight from foreign eyes and the German public, Hitler hatched a plan to take back lands he believed belonged to the German Reich.
There's never any question he's going to invade Poland. Poland, for German nationalists, is a sacred space, because Germans feel of all the losses in World War I at the Treaty of Versailles, the one they feel most keenly is the loss of the old Prussian heartland. These places have to be reclaimed. For Hitler to really stake his place in German history.
But there was a major obstacle in Hitler's way.
When Hitler learns that the British have signed an agreement with Poland to guarantee their independence and freedom from invasion, Hitler goes absolutely apoplectic. "I'll cook a stew they're guaranteed to choke on," he says.
A key ingredient of that recipe was an alliance with Poland's eastern neighbor, the Soviet Union. It required Hitler to join forces with a communist nation he professed to hate. But the strategic benefits meant he was ready to make a deal. German and Soviet foreign ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov met to agree a non-aggression pact between the two nations.
The German-Soviet pact was a shock, not just for the wider world, but it was also a shock, I think, for many of those around Hitler. For Stalin, the big advantage of the pact, of course, is that he keeps the Germans at arm's length.
Joseph Stalin, a man who usually trusted no one, put his trust in Adolf Hitler.
Signing the treaty with the Soviet Union in August of 1939 is one of Hitler's masterstrokes. Hitler has now signed a non-aggression pact that will allow him to begin his war with Poland without having to worry about war with the Soviet Union.
And in time-honored fashion, he slaps his knee, he orders champagne to be opened. Actually, he doesn't actually drink any champagne because he's a teetotaler, but nevertheless, this is celebration time.
What the Soviets didn't realize was that Hitler had a hidden agenda.
Hitler in this respect is a master tactician. He's incredibly cynical. He's breaking every diplomatic rule in the book. He is forging an agreement he fully intends to break.
As Hitler toasted the successful peace accord, he was just days away from igniting a world war. Adolf Hitler believed he was destined to reclaim living space for Germany. On the 1st of September 1939, he gave the order for the Wehrmacht to invade Poland. The Führer was certain Britain and France would not honor their guarantee to defend its borders.
He had to sit down with the British and French and had to discuss and negotiate about Czechoslovakia. But afterwards he thought to himself, I made a mistake. Our enemies are little worms, and I'm not going to go through that again.
Hitler had made a major miscalculation. Two days after his forces invaded Poland, Britain declared war on Germany. France followed less than 6 hours later.
Hitler makes a massive misjudgment. He thinks that this pact that Britain and Poland have signed to guarantee Polish safety is just British bluff. It's meaningless. Britain's no way going to step in if Germany invades Poland. And it therefore comes as a massive shock to Hitler when Britain reacts the way she does.
He's absolutely furious. He accuses Britain of trying to exterminate Germany. I mean, ludicrous kind of language, but it'll give you a level of his anger.
And the British weren't the only ones Hitler had misjudged.
With the invasion of Poland, the relationship between the German people and Hitler changes. They're suddenly beginning to get a glimpse of Hitler as a gambler. And I think that for many German people there's a worry about whether he's now bitten off more than he can chew.
The German people have no appetite for war. They were looking at Hitler as somebody that would rebalance the German economy, bring back peace and prosperity and security. They didn't want any part of another world war, and yet this is exactly what Hitler's going to give them.
To reassure the public, Hitler traveled to the Polish front line.
He is technically Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and he wants to be seen as the Supreme Commander, not just sitting at a desk somewhere in Berlin. Hitler boards his Führer train, as it's called, his armoured train, and he sets off for the front.
he uses it to become almost like a kind of battlefield tourist. You know, he's not really there as the head of the armed forces. He's simply there to bask in any German military glory as a politician.
He comes back and ostentatiously displays the dust on his trousers, becoming perhaps once again the frontline soldier he was in World War I.
Within a month, Poland fell and was divided up between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Nazi-Soviet pact left Hitler free to target an even more ambitious goal.
Hitler is asking the armed forces, how about the invasion of France? The French and the British will be caught off guard. The British are not even there yet. This is the moment, you know, when we need to attack. The army leadership says to Hitler, you just can't do it. We need a period of rest, reorganization, regrouping, and so on. For the German generals are being commanded now by somebody who does not understand many of the things that they're talking to him about. This does produce a very obvious tension.
Hitler's commanders were divided on an invasion strategy. They offered him two very different options for sending German forces into France.
Some officers argue for a conventional approach, a drive through Belgium and an invasion of France from the north. But a few officers want a more unconventional approach.
They're going to knife between the French army to the south and the British army to the north, cut them in two. This is an incredibly bold and daring plan.
This unconventional approach appeals to Hitler. He is not a trained staff officer. He is not an officer of any sort and has never done military planning. But something about the surprising nature of this suggestion appeals to him.
Hitler took the gamble. His panzer divisions powered through Belgium, Luxembourg, and across northeast France. Thousands of British troops were forced to evacuate from the beaches of Dunkirk. And then, in less than 7 weeks, their victory over the French opposition was complete.
All of this gives Hitler a sense of his own superiority and indomitability, but it also gives the Germans a sense that, wow, maybe Hitler is a genius.
The German generals also saw their Führer in a new light.
Certainly even they begin to think that perhaps Hitler actually has got some magic touch when it comes to strategy. And Hitler certainly thinks he's got a magic touch.
For Hitler, victory over France was all down to him. In this footage, shot inside his Belgian war room, he made the point crystal clear to his commanders.
So we see in this footage, there's his general with the pen, and Hitler wants to, no, this is my victory, and he steals the pen out of the general's hand. He wants to take ownership of that victory. Look at their heads placed close together in this footage. Hitler holds his head right in line with the general, saying, I own this.
With France conquered, Hitler was determined to exact maximum revenge.
Nowhere do we more see Hitler's theatricality and sense of revenge better displayed than when he forces the French to sign the armistice in the railway carriage at Compiègne.
Carefully choreographed to bring defeated France the maximum humiliation.
This is an incredibly symbolic act. That railway carriage is where the French made the Germans sign the armistice in 1918. And since then, that railway carriage had been stored in a museum for 20 years, and Hitler has it brought back to the exact spot where that armistice was signed.
Adolf Hitler had dreamed about this moment of revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, and he milked it for all it was worth.
He makes the French generals sit in that carriage. And he makes them wait. And he makes them wait. And he doesn't say a word for 10 minutes.
And then walks out while his generals read the terms.
There's a piece of paper for them to sign. Hitler's victory is absolutely complete.
It is the greatest day of his career. He has refought World War I, only this time with a more successful outcome.
Two days later, Hitler made his one and only trip to occupied Paris.
After the defeat of France, Hitler visits Paris with two architects, Albert Speer and Geisler, and his initial thought had been that as a punishment of the French people, he would destroy their capital city. He decides instead he can outdo the beauty of Paris. He doesn't have to destroy it. What he will do is eclipse it. He will create in Berlin, Germania, this city that is even more magnificent.
Hitler also goes to visit the tomb of Napoleon. That's no accident that he does that, because he identifies with a man like Napoleon. Napoleon, of course, was a great military leader, had conquered many countries, and Hitler sees himself in that mould.
Hitler was confident national euphoria would greet the return of Germany's savior. And with supreme power, he was ready to unleash a world of destruction. On the 6th of July 1940, 2 weeks after his lightning victory over France, Adolf Hitler returned to Berlin as the conquering hero.
It's like a scene out of Imperial Rome with Caesar coming back. Hitler is now a conquering emperor. He's a messianic figure.
The German people greet the onset of war with a certain trepidation. There had been no great enthusiasm. That anxiety had been modified somewhat by the easy and rapid victory in Poland. But now it has been erased altogether. There is a jubilant reception for Hitler back in Berlin. It is one of the greatest days for any statesman in the 20th century.
He's feeding on the energy the crowds give him. And it's making him stronger with every sea kyle, with every arm outstretched, with every flower that comes towards him. It builds him up as this god.
Stop the frame right here. You notice Hitler, he's grabbing the rail, he's leaning towards the crowd, he's soaking it in. I deserve this. I've worked all my life for this. Now, I'm here, I've arrived. Let's take a look at Goering. He's over here with the grin on his face, sending the signal he's not quite sure. I'm a little nervous. I don't know what to do with this. And that's the difference between a more normal person and a megalomaniac.
On the 10th of July 1940, Hitler assigned Hamm and Goering the task of testing their one remaining enemy, Britain. The Luftwaffe's mission was to destroy British ships and ports. Nine days into the Luftwaffe's airstrikes, Hitler's cast-iron belief in his own destiny saw him make a bold appeal to Winston Churchill.
Und Herr Churchill sollte mir dieses Mal vielleicht ausnahmsweise glauben, wenn ich als Prophet jetzt Folgendes ausspreche. Es wird dadurch ein großes Weltreich zerstört werden.
After the defeat of France, the real problem for Hitler is what to do about Britain. Hitler's view is basically schizophrenic. At one level, he clearly admires Britain, but on the other hand, he thinks Britain is the chief enemy to be smashed, destroyed.
In dieser Stunde fühle ich mich verpflichtet, vor meinem Gesicht noch einmal einen Appell an die Vernunft, auch in England zu richten. Ich glaube, dies tun zu können, weil ich ja nicht als besiegt um etwas bitte, sondern als Sieger nur für die Vernunft spreche.
It's not really a peace offer at all. I mean, it opens the door a little bit. It says, why don't you come to the conference table and we can, start to discuss things.
Ich sehe keinen Grund, der zur Fortführung dieses Kampfes zwingen könnte.
It's not at all clear, in fact, what Hitler has in mind, and perhaps not surprisingly, the British rejected.
Hitler realized the only way he could bring Churchill to the negotiating table was by force. By August 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged in the summer skies, he aimed to strengthen his hand elsewhere. Despite their non-aggression pact, Hitler felt the time was ripe to invade the Soviet Union.
He reacts to the fact that the British won't make peace. He doesn't quite know what to do about that. Stalin is now pushing into Eastern Europe. And he thinks in the end that by invading quickly, he will get extra resources, and he'll be able to use those resources for the final defeat of Britain.
Invading the Soviet Union would achieve an ideological goal he first outlined in Mein Kampf 16 years earlier: to destroy Jewish Bolshevism.
The Soviet Union and Hitler were never destined to be longtime partners, and definitely not destined to be friends. Hitler perceives this to be his destiny: the smashing of communism, the building of a great Germanic empire to the east.
March 1941. Despite airstrikes on Britain and his plans to invade the Soviet Union, Hitler was still obsessed with his public image. He invited the foreign press to run a feature on his life as a Bavarian country gentleman.
It's a terrible irony that during this time, while Hitler is overseeing dreadful atrocities against the Jews and greater use of concentration camps throughout Germany, that his international reputation is being nicely burnished by the liberal press, such as the New York Times. These fantastic profiles of Hitler showing him with his dogs and his whole retinue up in the Berghof.
It's an indication of how deluded Hitler is becoming, that he thinks that he can win over countries who are absolutely antagonistic towards him.
As his army geared up for the Soviet invasion, the Führer gave much thought to the name of the offensive. Once again, he took inspiration from his boyhood heroes.
The original code names for Germany's invasion of Russia were pretty mundane, actually. They were Fritz and Otto. And when Hitler hears about these names, he thinks that is not symbolic enough. Let's go with Barbarossa. The emperor of Germany's First Reich is very much tapping into that Teutonic myth of the endless struggle against the Slavs that we as a nation have ultimately got to overcome to guarantee our future survival.
On the 12th of November 1940, Hitler arranged a meeting with the Soviets, this time on German soil.
Stalin sends the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov to Berlin. From Stalin's point of view, this is an opportunity to renew the pact. From Hitler's point of view, he's trying to find out really what Stalin is thinking now.
It's all about keeping the Soviet Union sweet until the time is ripe for Hitler and Nazi Germany to invade the Soviet Union.
So, of course, Hitler is the great tactician, he is the great chess player, and he goes into this meeting trying to play Molotov.
Hitler aimed to keep the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, so he could take it for himself. He offered Molotov territory from the British Empire instead.
He promises Molotov India, a portion of the British Empire he has not yet even conquered.
But in Vyacheslav Molotov, the Führer faced a formidable opponent.
Molotov is a tough cookie and a tough negotiator. He peppers Hitler with very, very pointed questions. They don't stop.
Hitler is always the one doing the intimidating. He's the one shouting. He's the one pointing. He's the one making these people tremble. Yet, it's Molotov playing that game back at him. And Hitler starts trembling with anger that he's been made to look bad.
Molotov left with many unanswered questions. But crucially for Hitler, he had no inkling of war.
Molotov thinks the Germans are going to stay peaceful, Russia is not in any danger. And in fact, Hitler has fooled him completely and intensifies his plans on the attack of the Soviet Union shortly after Molotov leaves.
Hitler's master plan for a new order of Europe, led by the Aryan race, appeared to be on track. 11th of May 1941. The sunny day was about to darken for Germany's supreme leader. A letter arrived from Deputy Führer Rudolf Hess.
He is one of Hitler's most loyal henchmen, but he's actually a slightly pathetic man, and he's clearly out of his depths. Hitler starts to sideline him, and Hess decides that he's going to do his bit to win back the affections of the Führer.
And he wants to pull off something big, he wants to impress Hitler.
Hess wrote that he had flown to Britain on his own to try and broker a peace deal.
When Hitler hears about Hess's flight to Scotland, he goes absolutely apoplectic with rage. He emits, apparently, this almost animal-like scream. He's so angry. This is a recurring pattern in Hitler's life. When things go badly for him, he has a meltdown.
He's horrified because he sees it as a personal betrayal, but politically this is going to create all kinds of problems. His closest comrade is actually trying to broker peace with Britain. Is there a possibility that Hess is going to let the cat out of the bag about the invasion of Russia. So this is probably one of the biggest shocks of Hitler's life.
After several attempts, Hitler came up with what he thought was the right cover story. He announced that Rudolf Hess had lost his mind.
If your number 2 is going on such an idiotic trip, it makes your whole regime look laughable.
And that was exactly the reaction reported in newsreels when Hess was taken prisoner.
And now the amazing story of Rudolf Hess, the Führer's deputy. What the inside story is behind this dramatic episode, we shall probably learn in due course. But on the general principle of Nazi leaders coming over here to give themselves up, the more the merrier.
Hitler is worried that his credibility is going to be reduced to such a level that he may never recover from this, which is why, of course, he very quickly organizes a meeting with his senior party officials to try and shore up his authority and say, look, nothing's changed.
In the wake of the Hess affair, Hitler summoned 70 of his top officials and in a tearful speech demands their loyalty. It's a form of emotional blackmail. Hitler learns a lesson from the Hess affair, and that is perhaps never to bring anyone too close. There will never be another deputy Führer in the Third Reich.
Hitler abolished Hess's position of deputy Führer.
And bit by bit, he's reducing the possibility that anyone else in the Nazi power structure is actually going to help him make decisions, or at least influence him in his decision-making process. And that ultimately, unfortunately, in the middle of a world war, is not necessarily a good thing.
The stress of the crisis only added to the Führer's health problems.
Hitler suffers from numerous medical complaints, and they've afflicted him for years.
He has all sorts of symptoms of stress. So he has insomnia, he has stomach problems, he has terrible eczema. These are the conditions that draw him to seek medical treatment.
It's also important to remember that a lot of Hitler's complaints are probably in the mind. He is a terrible hypochondriac.
He gets polyps on his vocal cords, no doubt as a result of all that kind of shouting, and immediately suspects that it's cancer. He saw both his parents die fairly young, and of course he saw his mother's death from cancer.
During the war, Hitler had become increasingly dependent on drugs, prescribed by Dr. Theodor Morell, his personal physician since 1936.
People around Hitler don't like Dr. Morell. He is smelly, dirty, and people instinctively don't trust him.
Hitler just snaps back. I don't employ him for his fragrance. I employ him for how he can cure me.
Among his health issues was a chronic sinus condition for which Dr. Morell prescribed cocaine.
Dr. Morell gives him what we today basically just term Class A drugs.
I think that probably explains the sort of sudden frustrated outburst that he makes every time he gets a bit of bad news. It gets to the point where his military staff are almost terrified to give him bad news.
Hitler's body is just a cocktail of different drugs that are all reacting in all sorts of strange ways within him, and increasingly creating very strange and psychotic behaviour.
May 1941. As Hitler prepared to invade the Soviet Union, he worked his racial and ideological vendettas into the plans. He issued his so-called criminal orders to the armed forces.
Hitler issues orders to free the soldiers of any legal comeback if they shoot civilians, hence the description of these orders as criminal orders. The end game for Hitler was to deal with the Jewish problem and to deal with Bolshevism, and criminal orders that catered for both these two groups.
There's an extraordinary kind of distance between Hitler sitting in his headquarters saying we've got to be brutal against the Russians, and German soldiers on the Russian front who are rounding up villagers, putting them in a barn and burning them to death.
But it shows you how detached he is morally from the consequences of what he's asking people to do, which is murder, and murder civilians, and murder children as well. And an indication of how morally bankrupt, frankly, Hitler's become by 1941.
The night before the Soviet invasion, Hitler was in his apartment with Albert Speer, listening to some of his favorite music, Les Préludes by Franz Liszt.
And he says to Speer, listen to that, Albert, because you're going to be hearing that a lot from now on. That's going to be the music for our victory fanfare over the Russians. He's so sure he's going to win.
On the 22nd of June 1941, Adolf Hitler ordered 3 million troops to march into Russia. Like Napoleon before him, this decision meant he was fighting a two-front war for the conquest of Europe.
He's thinking that he's invulnerable. Hitler sees the Soviet Union as a necessary showdown between good and evil.
Adolf Hitler's racist wrath was unleashed upon both Soviet soldiers and civilians. Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, Bolsheviks, men, women and children were massacred by the Nazi SS as the German army advanced.
He thinks that the salvation of the Aryan race has to come through the defeat of the Jews. So at this stage, killing millions is not a problem for Hitler.
He is starting the biggest military campaign the world has ever seen and will result in millions of deaths. Hitler still likes to see and project this image of himself as still being this slightly bohemian figure, and he says, rather than waging all this war, I'd rather just be wandering around Italy. He's a war leader, but he's also has his gentle side. He's a painter. It's complete nonsense. Hitler does have a lust for war, and he says that German gains should be made in blood.
In November 1941, millions of German troops advanced through the Soviet Union. It was the largest army in history ever mobilized for a single campaign. Adolf Hitler would oversee the invasion from the dense forests of East Prussia at his new command center, the Wolf's Lair.
Hitler very much has in mind that he has to, appear to be the general at the front, in contact with his own troops, absorbing the realities of the war.
It's not a nice place to be, and Hitler, with his sort of noted and malignant illnesses and hypochondria, this was not the type of place where he really wanted to be. He festered in places like that.
It was not a choice posting for most people because, it was remote, it was mosquito-ridden, and you had to endure Hitler.
Amongst Hitler's many failings is an inability to stick to a schedule. And the schedule at Wolf's Lair was a constant problem. There is a situation report sometime around noon, lasts a couple of hours, followed by a lunch, followed by another situation report. The boredom sets in amongst the officers. They begin to stifle yawns.
Hitler in a place like that was insufferable, because all of his little petty bourgeois habits were accentuated, sitting around long after lunch, telling stories, talking about his rise. And so people just found it absolutely stultifying.
We can be talking one moment about an armored operation on the Eastern Front. Hitler will suddenly stare off into the distance and begin talking about how the Crimea will become a vacation spot for Germans after the victorious war is concluded. He will then drift back into the topic at hand, but meanwhile, the staff may have drifted off. It's a nightmare for systematic planning.
These private images taken by Walter Frenz, the Führer's personal cameraman, masked his weaknesses as Supreme Commander.
The generals try and skirt around him. They try to carry out their operations, I think, regardless.
He will reject a lot of the analysis that is given him until late in the afternoon. Then he'll sort of absently look over it, make a few bad decisions. So this is a guy who's not in any way, shape, or form acquainted with the actual physical realities on the Eastern Front or the Western Front.
On the 5th of December 1941, Hitler took tea and watched movies, while his 5-month-old assault against the Soviet Union began to unravel. Red Army counterattacks forced Germany's troops back from Moscow.
This is a man who thinks that he could invade the Soviet Union and conquer it in a matter of a few months. It is patently absurd and totally unrealistic. Hitler's shambolic leadership has a directly negative impact on military performance.
2 days later, the Japanese attacked US forces at Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese have attacked the U.S. Navy and forced the Americans to pursue the war in the Far East, giving Germany a decent interval to try to win the war in Europe.
When he hears about Pearl Harbor and the fact that he's got another ally in this great struggle of the Second World War, he's euphoric.
Four days after Pearl Harbor, Hitler addressed his deputies, the Reichstag, and officials from Italy and Japan.
Deutschland, Italien und Japan werden den ihnen von den Vereinigten Staaten von Amerika und England aufgezwungenen Krieg mit allen ihnen zu Gebot stehenden Machtmitteln gemeinsam bis zum siegreichen Ende führen.
Hitler declared war on the United States.
Any sane onlooker has to be thunderstruck by the complacency with which Hitler greets the U.S. entry into the war. Hitler really doesn't care.
Hitler's counter-argument to that at the time would be, well, the Americans are effectively supporting the British anyway. War is inevitable sooner or later, so why not go on our own terms? You are the one who makes the decision. You don't allow America to declare war on you. You declare war on America.
Hitler is now living in the realms of fantasy. Hitler isn't just monumentally misguided, he's also totally paranoid.
Among his delusions was his long-held belief that the Jews were responsible for all his troubles.
Hitler points to the entry of the U.S. into the war as yet more example of this internationalist Jewish conspiracy, through the banks, through the media, through political elites that are ganging up against him.
And of course, like all good conspiracy theories, there is one underlying theme behind both of those threats from East and West for Hitler is the sinister figure of the Jew.
Hitler is losing the plot. To him, this all makes complete sense.
As the Soviet Union prepared to push back, the British stood firm, and America ready to join the war. Hitler's path to victory was blocked. But Germany's messianic dictator still predicted triumph. To Hitler, this ideological crusade was worth the sacrifice of millions of lives.
This is someone who is inhumane. This is someone who would stop at nothing to inflate his own position and that of Germany.
This is the moment when Hitler has decided he's going to drag everyone down with him. After this, there's no going back.
Extraordinary objects, but will there be a once-in-a-lifetime deal for them? 4 Rooms, now run by Sarah Beanie, brand new tomorrow night at 9 here on More 4. And Tuesday at 9 we'll do contemporary coastal with some envy-inducing homes by the sea in Suffolk. Next tonight though, it's Father Ted.